Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They were supposed to be our salvation. Gleaming giants, bred in secrecy, armored in the newest ceramite, wielding bolt rifles engineered for perfection. The Greyshields stood like living monuments to hope reborn in an age of endless despair. When they emerged from the darkness, whole worlds cheered. Their arrival was a symbol of rebirth, of Guilliman's divine return and Call's miraculous science. To the Imperium, they were a gift. To the dying chapters, they were reinforcements. To the faithful, they were saints in ceramite. But under the polished surface of these warriors lies a truth no one dares speak. The Greyshields are not heroes. They are the result of an experiment so vast, so cold, and so brutally calculated that even the Mechanicus would hesitate to call it human. The moment their boots touched Imperial soil, the lie began. These were not warriors forged by honor and trial, not veterans born of brotherhood and shared fire. They were constructs, souls burned clean of history, minds molded to fit a pattern, and bodies tailored to survive anything except freedom. The galaxy did not receive saviors. It received soldiers without choice, bred not to ask why, but to kneel, march, and die. And in this perhaps we glimpse the most damning truth of all, that the Imperium never wanted heroes. It wanted tools. The Greyshields were not born to fight for mankind. They were forged to keep mankind silent. The mind of Belisarius Call is a labyrinth none have fully charted, not even the Archmagos himself. Within its rusted corridors and lightning-scarred vaults lies a grand ambition that would have horrified even the Emperor in his most hubristic moments. 10,000 years ago, as the galaxy trembled in the wake of Horus's betrayal and the dream of unity shattered into an age of fire, Call received a directive from Guilliman. Prepare for a time when the Imperium would need a new kind of warrior. And so, while the galaxy burned and bled, Call vanished into silence, vanishing from records, carving out hidden sanctums across Mars, Luna, and beyond. His work was not a labor of love. It was a cold arithmetic of perfection, with human life as the variable. To call the creation of the Primaris legions science is to diminish the scope of Call's endeavor. What he undertook was not science, but alchemy of the darkest kind. He cannibalized gene seed from all known loyalist legions, including those believed unstable or extinct. From the sons of Dorn to the blood-cursed scions of Sanguinius, their sacred genetic lines were dissected, resequenced, hybridized, and reforged. Where data was incomplete, he reconstructed genomes through arcane manipulations, fed by thousands of years of tech priest archives and forbidden vaults. He created new organs, more robust and invasive than anything imagined by the Emperor's original artisans: the sinew coils, the magma coagulators, the multi-lung derivatives. These were not enhancements, they were reinventions. The true horror, however, was not merely biological, it was temporal. Call did not just play with flesh, he played with time. For millennia, he grew these warriors in artificially suspended developmental environments, refining failure after failure until the prototypes no longer screamed as their organs rewrote their reality. Generations of test subjects, many never birthed into full consciousness, perished in chemical vats and artificial wombs. Thousands, perhaps millions, of failed Primaris never lived to see the Emperor's light. There were whispers, never confirmed, that Call even experimented with gene craft sourced from ancient enemies. Xeno's resilience, warp-resistant traits, self-healing cellular matrices not native to humanity. If true, then the Greyshields are not only a new species of space marine, they are something else entirely. Call was never sentimental. His loyalty is to knowledge, and his morality a machine logic that accepts suffering as the price of survival. He had no qualms about using the gene stock of traitor legions if it suited the goal. Perhaps he purged it, perhaps he didn't. We will never know. The Adeptus Mechanicus does not ask questions of its saints, and Guilliman, awakening to a galaxy on the brink of annihilation, had little time for purity tests. He needed warriors. Call provided them, and what of the machine's will? The cogitators and logic engines that aided Call's work were said to be older than Mars itself, powered by quantum psionics and guided by ancient intelligences locked beneath the red sands. Some believe the machines themselves made choices, that the Greyshields were not merely sculpted by Call's hand, but by something colder, older, and infinitely more alien. There are rumors of psychic bleed-throughs in early Primaris batches, Strange visions during the acceleration phase, flickers of personalities that never matched any known source. Some adepts vanished. Others were found mad, raving about ancestral ghosts or distant voices beyond the veil of real space. The Imperium hails the Primaris as a triumph of logic over faith. But what if they are something far darker, not a symbol of rebirth, but a tombstone for the Age of Honor? Their creation was not noble. It was necessary, yes, but not noble. Every Greyshield is a product of 10,000 years of harvested agony, vivisectional mastery, and unspeakable choices made in the silence of void-bastioned laboratories. The tragedy is that they do not know this. They emerge fully formed, armored, weaponized, and told they are heroes. But they are echoes of decisions made by minds that no longer feel guilt. They are not sons, they are weapons. And in every perfect sinew, every flawless implant, there is the residue of Call's cold ambition. A monument to a future where war is no longer fought by men, but by things that only resemble them. The transformation from gene-forged body to battlefield entity is not a process of maturation, it is a ritual of erasure. Before they are given a bolter, before they swear any oath, the Greyshields are broken and rebuilt in mind as completely as in flesh. They do not begin life as sons of Guilliman or Dorn or Vulcan. They begin in sterile silence, monitored by machines that calibrate emotion, behavior, and loyalty like voltages in a circuit. Their very sense of self is sculpted through layers of neuro-indoctrination that strip away curiosity, individuality, and history. What remains is not blankness, but something worse, a personality carefully constructed to appear noble while hiding absolute obedience beneath its mask. The indoctrination halls are not temples of learning or martial training grounds. They are factories of the soul. Imagine a place where dreams are written, not born, where even memory is manufactured. Greyshields do not remember childhood. They remember simulations of childhood, carefully scripted experiences fed to them through neural stimulation and immersive data loops. These memories feel real because they were designed to. They feel joy, loss, triumph, even sibling bonds. But every one of these emotions was chosen, not lived. That artificial foundation ensures loyalty not to truth, but to the narrative imposed upon them. They love the Emperor because they are programmed to. They obey the Codex because it is the only scripture they've ever known. Even their names are chosen for symmetry and conformity. Identity becomes performance. Unlike the firstborn, who lived through the crucible of recruitment, kidnapped, tested, broken, reborn through trial, the Greyshields emerge fully conditioned. Their fears have already been resolved. Their doubts have already been suppressed. Their sense of justice, courage, and sacrifice are predefined parameters. This is not to say they are emotionless, far from it. They weep, laugh, rage, and mourn. But those emotions occur within corridors already mapped by the indoctrination schema. There is no real freedom. There is only the illusion of it, a curated personality profile that feels authentic because it was designed to. What makes this all the more disturbing is how effective it is. The Greyshields are paragons of discipline, strategy, and valor. They form bonds quickly, perform under impossible pressure, and inspire awe in all who witness them. And yet, beneath that brilliance lies a terrifying absence, the absence of natural evolution. They have not earned who they are. They were built to be it. There is no deviation, no messy humanity, no flawed journey toward selfhood. They are the culmination of what the Imperium always wanted its warriors to be: unbreakable, unquestioning, and efficient. But something strange happens when a mind is given emotions without agency. A few among the Greyshields begin to sense the hollowness of their memories. They speak in dreams of places they've never visited, wars they've never fought, or brothers they swear they once knew. Some develop uncanny empathy, a psychic echo of the lives never lived. Others display unexplained melancholy, a sense of loss with no source. These are anomalies, tolerated but watched. The tech priests call them drift events, deviations in the data sequence of psychological coding. The chaplains whisper of ghost code, the remnants of failed minds bleeding into new ones. In rare cases, entire squads have been retired, reassigned, or simply vanished after demonstrating too much personality. And yet, for all its control, the indoctrination is not perfect. The human spirit, even grafted into a post-human shell, resists total automation. Some Greyshields ask questions, some begin to form loyalties outside their programming. A handful even refuse orders, rare but real. These deviations are not punished openly, but they are erased silently. The Imperium cannot tolerate unpredictability in its new elite. The indoctrination of the Greyshields reveals a dark symmetry to their design, that they are not meant to be men with weapons, but weapons that believe they are men. Their heroism is not chosen, it is installed. And in that, we see the death of what made the Adeptus Astartes more than just soldiers. We see the rise of a new kind of warrior, one who cannot betray because he has never been allowed to imagine another way. To the outside eye, the Greyshields were the answer to a prayer. Reinforcements clad in storm gray armor, arriving by the thousands, unaligned, unsullied, and prepared to bolster the failing chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. They were hailed as brothers, embraced into the fortress monasteries of warriors whose bloodlines traced back to the dawn of the Imperium. But what seemed like a reunion was, in truth, an invasion. These warriors were not brothers. They were strangers with synthetic souls, bearing no memory of shared glories, no scars from the same battles. And their integration was not an act of healing, it was a subtle conquest. The idea of chapter identity in the Imperium is sacred. Each one is more than a military force. It is a culture, a legend, a shrine to its Primarch's legacy. The sons of Russ hunt as wolves. The sons of Sanguinius mourn as angels. The sons of Dorn build walls even in peace. To fold Greyshields into these cultures was to ask fire to flow like water. They were expected to adopt traditions they did not understand, swear oaths that meant nothing to them, and mourn heroes whose names were programmed into them only weeks before arrival. And yet, they performed the rites flawlessly. Too flawlessly. Rituals that should have taken years to internalize were mimicked with eerie precision. It wasn't reverence, it was replication. A performance. Within the chapters, old tensions flared. Firstborn Astartes, many of whom had fought through centuries of attrition and betrayal, looked upon these newcomers with suspicion. They spoke the right words, but their eyes carried none of the burden. They executed drills with precision, but their loyalty felt theoretical, not earned. Whispers spread. Some accused the Greyshields of espionage, of being plants not reinforcements. Others believed they were mind-wiped spies, sent not to reinforce, but to monitor. Paranoia took root, and in that fertile soil, something cruel blossomed, the slow erosion of trust. More insidious was the way the Greyshields were divided. They were not dispatched in cohesive units, but fractured and distributed among various chapters, often in clusters too small to retain identity. This fragmentation had a purpose. It prevented the formation of their own culture, their own rituals, their own voice. Scattered like seeds in the wind, they were meant to dissolve into the soil of their adoptive chapters. But a seed does not forget what it is. In private, Greyshields still called each other by their original designations. They shared a bond that transcended gene line, a strange kinship forged not in war, but in the same artificial womb, the same dream-forged memories. It was not true brotherhood. It was a ghost of one. As this undercurrent of dual loyalty grew, so too did the tension within chapters. Some Greyshields found themselves favored, hailed for their efficiency, their lack of ego, their unflinching discipline. This bred resentment among the firstborn, who had bled for centuries only to be replaced by post-human newcomers with no understanding of sacrifice. Others were ostracized, used as shock troops, or sent into impossible missions under the guise of proving their worth. Some chapters even requested not to receive any Greyshields at all. The divide was not merely ideological. It was strategic. The High Lords had engineered a subtle reshaping of the Adeptus Astartes, and it worked. By splintering the Greyshields and inserting them into every corner of the Adeptus Astartes, the Imperium began a quiet campaign of centralization. No longer would each chapter drift too far from Terra's control. With Greyshields in every fortress monastery, the Imperium had eyes, ears, and influence embedded at every level. This was not reinforcement, it was reorientation. The very fabric of loyalty was being rewoven, not to Primarchs, but to the Imperium itself. Yet for all this manipulation, a strange truth emerged. Some Greyshields began to form real bonds. Despite their programming, they found meaning in their adopted cultures. A few even grew to embody the very traditions they were meant to erode. They became space wolves who howled with true joy, blood angels who wept at the death of innocents, ultramarines who strategized not because they were taught to, but because they believed. But those were rare. Most remained caught between two identities, too artificial to fully belong, too assimilated to rebel. In the end, the Greyshields were never meant to belong. They were the quiet tide that rose beneath the fortress walls, changing the landscape one stone at a time. Their presence fractured old brotherhoods and seeded a new kind of unity, one imposed from above, not born from below. And in that transformation, we see the loss of something vital. Not just trust, not just tradition, but the soul of the legions themselves. Perfection is always a lie, especially in the Imperium. When Robert Gaiman unveiled the Primaris Space Marines, the narrative was clear. These were flawless warriors, superior in every way to their firstborn predecessors. Taller, faster, more resilient, genetically refined. The embodiment of what the Emperor might have created, had he the time. But beneath that gleaming myth, beneath the chemically enhanced muscles and transhuman organs, lie secrets far more troubling. The truth is that the Greyshields, like all constructs of human ambition, are not perfect, and some among them carry flaws so deeply buried that even they do not know it. Flaws that threaten not just their lives, but the soul of what it means to be Astartes. Early field reports from chapters that integrated Greyshields spoke of uncanny calm in battle. They performed with machine-like discipline, exhibiting little of the berserk fury that characterized many firstborn. For some, this was seen as a virtue. For others, it was unsettling. They fought too cleanly, too coldly, their violence detached, as if they were watching themselves from a distance. Chaplains began noticing a troubling absence in confessionals, not a lack of guilt, but a lack of introspection. Some Greyshields did not understand what guilt was. They could mimic contrition, but they could not feel it. It was not that they had no soul. It was that their souls were built with shutters already closed. More disturbing were the whispers of psychic instability. Though the Primaris were supposedly resistant to the warp's corruptive influence, a result of new organs and refined neural barriers, anomalies persisted. Librarians reported that some Greyshields, particularly those from more volatile gene line templates, experienced sudden surges of psychic feedback, strange dreams, visions of figures not their own, empathic bleed from nearby minds, even telepathic echoes of the dead. These events were not openly discussed. They were buried under administrative euphemism, neurological turbulence, cognitive recursion, mnemonic imprint distortion. But the symptoms were real, and they were spreading. In certain cases, entire squads began exhibiting collective behavior patterns not tied to mission parameters. Sudden shifts in combat style, ritualistic post-battle gestures, spontaneous chants in dead dialects. When questioned, they claimed no memory of these acts. Some tech priests began theorizing that the residual psychic trauma of failed gene forging, the countless echo lives lost in Call's experiments, had not been fully scrubbed. That ghost data remained within certain gene seed strands, waiting for stress or proximity to trigger activation. In essence, the Greyshields were not clean slates. They were palimpsests, overwrites of ancient, broken warriors, some of whom were never meant to be born. And then there's the question of emotion. Some Primaris began displaying what could only be described as emotional blunting. Not stoicism, true numbness. A chaplain of the Imperial Fists once described a Greyshield who watched 3 of his squadmates die in a plasma blast without flinching, then calmly retrieved their gene seed and returned to battle. Not out of strength, but indifference. He spoke of them later, the chaplain said, as if he had read about their deaths in a book. Others, conversely, developed hyper-emotional reactions, explosive rage, sudden mourning, uncontrollable grief over minor losses. The regulation of emotional stability, it seems, was another lever Call adjusted, but never mastered. The High Lords and Mechanicus refused to acknowledge these defects publicly. The Primaris must be seen as incorruptible, but privately, inquiries were made. Units were quietly reassigned. Some Greyshields disappeared from records altogether. A few chapters began isolating them, denying them sacred rights or limiting their leadership opportunities. The Inquisition took interest, never a good sign. When the Ordo Hereticus begins to whisper, one knows that truth is no longer a matter of evidence, but of containment. Even more troubling are the persistent rumors that some Primaris exhibit subconscious resistance to control, slight hesitations in obedience, flashes of unprogrammed behavior, instances of independent thought outside indoctrinated norms. These moments are rare, but real. And when a weapon begins to think for itself, the line between asset and liability grows perilously thin. In their pursuit of the perfect warrior, Guilliman and Call may have created something deeply unstable. Not monstrous, not corrupted, but deeply, intrinsically wrong. The gene flaws of the firstborn were obvious: the red thirst, the black rage, the canis helix. But these Greyshields carry flaws that are invisible until they fracture. Psychological ghosts. Emotional scars they never earned. Memories they never lived. They are not broken, they are misaligned. Not failures, but echoes of failure made flesh. And in time, that may prove far more dangerous than any demon or heretic. They were not placed into chapters simply to reinforce. They were not bred merely to fight. The Greyshields were also weapons of ideology, silent crusaders in a war most within the Imperium didn't even know was being waged. This was the war for loyalty. Not loyalty to honor, nor to valor, nor even to the Emperor as a being. It was loyalty to the Imperium, to its machine logic, its bureaucratic inertia, and its ultimate authority. Guilliman knew the decay had seeped deep. The firstborn, relics of older dreams, bore with them allegiances to fallen primarchs, extinct cultures, and rebellious creeds. The Greyshields were meant to sever those roots. They were seeds of a new orthodoxy, grown in vats and baptized in blind obedience. Each one of them was molded with loyalty as a built-in directive, embedded so deeply it could not be unlearned. Not just loyalty to their mission or their commanders, but to the very structure of imperial rule. They were never meant to question orders from Terra, no matter how convoluted or cruel. They were designed to accept decree as divine, to treat administratum bureaucracy as sacred ritual, to see Guilliman not only as Primarch but as regent, arbiter, and voice of the throne. Their very purpose was to tilt the cultural axis of the Astartes, away from their once separate identities and toward a unified imperial core. The old chapters, proud and often insular, were dangerous precisely because of their independence. The Space Wolves had always walked the knife's edge of disobedience. The Blood Angels, steeped in the madness of genetic legacy, clung to rituals the ecclesiarchy barely tolerated. Even the Ultramarines, for all their discipline, maintained cultural sovereignty within the borders of Ultramar. These were not isolated anomalies. They were ideological fractures, fissures in the body politic of the Imperium. Guilliman knew that to preserve the Empire, he would need more than strength. He would need conformity. And so, the Greyshields became the scalpel that would cut away the rot. Subtly, steadily, they began to shift the balance. Within every chapter that accepted them, a new dynamic emerged. The Greyshields followed not the chapter's myths, but the Codex Astartes as doctrine. They quoted imperial dogma over tribal legends. They honored the Emperor not as father, but as state. Their rituals were sterile, their liturgies standardized. Their very existence undermined centuries of cultural divergence. It wasn't sabotage, it was standardization, a slow erosion of identity under the weight of conformity. Some resisted. Veteran Astartes watched in silent fury as their halls echoed with unfamiliar chants, as their chapter serfs bowed before new litanies, as their sacred rites were replaced with prescribed ceremony. What they saw as tradition, the Greyshields labeled as inefficiency. What they called brotherhood, the Greyshields saw as deviation. Conflicts were rare. Open defiance, rarer still. But the tension simmered. And where confrontation arose, it was often the firstborn who were sidelined, demoted, or reassigned. The Greyshields had the blessing of Guilliman himself. They were not just new warriors. They were the correct warriors. Even beyond the chapters, their presence altered the balance. High Lords could rely on Greyshields to enforce doctrine without hesitation. They acted as clean instruments of command, unaffected by local loyalties or tradition. On frontier worlds and within rebellious sectors, it was often the Primaris, not the Old Guard, who were trusted to execute compliance actions. When a governor needed to be corrected, when a shrine world drifted from acceptable interpretation, when a chapter master hesitated to follow an ecclesiarchical mandate, it was often a Greyshield-led strike force that ensured obedience. Not through brute force. through visible, precise, unyielding adherence to central authority. This did not go unnoticed. Whispers grew among the librarious circles that the Greyshields were being used not just as soldiers, but as enforcers of Guilliman's new vision. That the old dream of the Emperor, of humanity united in spirit and will, had become a cold administrative nightmare, policed by warriors who had never known freedom. Some began to call them the Regent's dogs, in hushed tones. Not out of malice, but out of mourning. For the brotherhood they once knew, for the culture that was slowly being rewritten. But here lies the cruelest irony. The Greyshields themselves do not see this war. They believe in their mission. They believe they are serving mankind, and in their minds, they are heroes. Yet the very systems they uphold, the bureaucracy, the rigidity, the suppression of dissent, are the chains that keep the Imperium from becoming anything greater. They do not enforce loyalty to ideals. They enforce loyalty to power. The silent war is not one of rebellion. It is a war of memory, of whether the future will remember the Astartes as warriors of soul and sorrow or as cold instruments of state. And in that war, the Greyshields are winning, not through bloodshed, but through quiet, unshakable, obedient presence. There is a kind of reverence that surrounds the image of a space marine, a towering knight wrapped in ceramite, emblem of wrath and honor, forged in fire and sworn to die for mankind. The firstborn embodied this myth in all its flawed, tragic glory. They bore their humanity like a scar, a reminder that beneath the power there remained echoes of men, prideful, loyal, afraid, and sometimes broken. But the Greyshields? The Greyshields are something else entirely. Their creations stripped away the chaos of human nature and replaced it with something far colder. They are not flawed heroes. They are function made flesh. At first glance, the improvements seem obvious. Primaris Marines heal faster, strike harder, endure longer. Their organs are more efficient, their reflexes more precise. They are, by all measurable standards, superior. And yet, when you watch them walk, fight, or stand silent in formation, there is something missing. A hollowness, a sense that they do not carry burdens, not because they have overcome them, but because they were never allowed to bear them in the first place. Their humanity was not tempered, it was edited. The firstborn were broken children, rebuilt by agony. Their loyalty came from trial, their wisdom from pain. They bled beside mortals, argued with serfs, sang dirges for lost comrades. They had memories of family, of weakness, of failure. These memories did not make them weak, they made them noble. Every time a firstborn Astartes stepped onto the battlefield, he carried not just his weapons, but the weight of identity. The Greyshields carry no such weight. They carry programming. There is no haunted past, no ghost of a brother slain in the Scola, no bitter lesson learned in the heat of defeat. Their pain is theoretical. Their courage, algorithmic. This absence becomes glaring in moments of stillness. A veteran of the Salamanders may pause before a battlefield, whispering the names of the innocents he failed to save. A wolf lord might howl beneath the stars for a fallen pack brother, weeping with fists clenched in fury. But a Greyshield? He simply calibrates his gear, awaits the order, and marches forward. Not out of coldness, but because he does not know how else to be. His rituals are borrowed, his symbols taught, his soul perhaps never fully formed. There are chaplains who will not say this aloud, but they feel it. That in their liturgies, the Greyshields repeat the words without understanding their shape. That in their vows there is precision but no fire. Not a lack of faith, but a lack of wound. A soul that has never been torn cannot understand sacrifice. And so, though they may fight with valor, they do so like instruments, pure, clean, and somehow distant. They do not burn. They function. This raises a terrifying possibility. What if the very traits that make them successful are the traits that make them dangerous? What if their strength lies not in nobility, but in the absence of struggle? Because a warrior who has never questioned his purpose, never wept for his fallen, never stood at the edge of despair and chosen to rise, that warrior may never break. But he may also never change. And without change, there can be no redemption. No hope, no growth, only repetition. Even among the Greyshields, this truth sometimes flickers. Some begin to mimic their firstborn brothers in more than posture. They try to feel, they collect keepsakes, they craft their own litanies, they stare at stars and wonder what lies beyond the next war. And in those moments, they take a step toward humanity. But for many, that step is too wide. Their minds are wired for obedience, not doubt. For certainty, not contemplation. The spark of personality, where it exists, is fragile. A candle flickering in the wind of indoctrination. One cannot help but feel a sense of mourning, not for what they are, but for what they were never allowed to become. These are not warriors who fell from grace. They are warriors who never climbed. Their nobility is manufactured. Their wrath is rehearsed. Their victories, though real, feel sterile. They are not heroes in the old sense. They are successful products of a failed empire. And yet, perhaps, that is the truest tragedy. That in trying to perfect the Space Marine, the Imperium created something inhuman. Something that cannot betray, but also cannot forgive. Something that will never turn against the Emperor, but will never truly fight for him either. The Greyshields are not the next step in evolution. They are the beginning of extinction, not of strength, but of soul. The Imperium's enemies are legion, and its greatest warriors must always bleed at the edges of the world. But there's something unsettling about the way the Greyshields were deployed. Not as honor guards or fortress lords, not even as the vanguard of prestigious crusades. They were sent to the blackest pits of warfare, to worlds drowning in plague, to void sieges already lost, to hellscapes where even seasoned chapters had broken and withdrawn. And they did not hesitate. They marched into death without question, without history, without even the faint hope of being remembered. The Greyshields were deployed not like precious reinforcements, but like consumables. Patterns began to emerge. Repeated instances of newly founded Primaris units, some mere months into service, assigned to war zones long labeled untenable. These weren't just desperate fronts. They were meat grinders, the kinds of places where even the Astra Militarum hesitated to commit elite troops. Hive worlds overrun with demonic taint, Eldar-held webway breaches sealed for millennia, Necron tomb worlds stirring beneath planetary crusts. Time and again, it was the Greyshields who were sent first. They were tested, measured, and pushed to the limits of endurance, not just by the enemy, but by their own creators. Call, for all his brilliance, understood that data born of theory is meaningless without trial. And so the battlefield became the final phase of his experiment. How do new organs behave under prolonged exposure to warp corruption? How do emotion-coded warriors respond to total psychic trauma? How does a unit operate when cut off from command hierarchy and support? These are not strategic questions. These are clinical ones. And for every squad that returned or didn't, a vault deep beneath Mars gained another data file, another step toward refining the next batch. There is a terrible possibility in this, that many of the war zones chosen for Greyshield deployment were not selected for necessity, but for utility. That their casualties were not misfortunes, but metrics. The implication is monstrous, but all too familiar. The Imperium has always treated its warriors as tools, but never before with this level of controlled detachment. The Greyshields were never allowed to be legends. They were test subjects in a galaxy-sized crucible. Their deaths were not mourned. They were recorded. Worse still, this reality filtered down to those they fought beside. In many cases, allied chapters came to view Greyshields as disposable, not just by command directive, but by instinct. They were sent first into breach zones, held the lines during retreat, covered evacuations that no one expected them to survive. Their silence only reinforced the perception. Greyshields rarely resisted these roles. Whether it was programming, loyalty, or lack of self-worth, they accepted their assignments without protest. And when they died clean. No ritual, no lamentation, no saga. Only silence, then replacement. But there were exceptions. Some among the Greyshields began to question, not loudly, never in defiance, but in glances, in recorded logs, in subtle shifts of phrasing during post-action debriefings. They began to wonder why they were always the first to bleed. Why their victories were never celebrated, only noted. A few even reached out to firstborn brothers seeking connection, seeking meaning. These were not revolts. They were cries in the void. And many of them were quickly reassigned, or vanished. The term war zones of disposal began as a whisper, first among chapter serfs, then within librarius records, then spoken aloud only by those too broken to fear reprisal. It is not an official designation. No scroll bears its mark, but everyone knows what it means. It means deployment with no return path. It means sacrifice not for victory, but for observation. It means being sent to die not for glory, but because your death might yield an insight. This brutal reality casts a shadow across every lauded success of the Primaris. The Indomitus Crusade, with its endless victories and reclaimed worlds, becomes a little less triumphant when one realizes how many Greyshields bled to make it possible. Not just as warriors, but as data points. It becomes clear that the Imperium did not trust them fully. It wanted to test them, to see what kind of monsters it had made. And yet, despite this, they fought. They held lines that no one else could hold. They won battles that should have been impossible. Even in death, they gave everything. Not because they were ordered to, but because they believed they were meant to. That belief, programmed or not, makes them tragic beyond measure. Because in the end, they were not thrown away because they were flawed. They were thrown away because they were useful. And in the Imperium, usefulness is the first step toward expendability. To most within the Imperium, failure is a luxury, a brief moment before death or disgrace. But for the Greyshields, failure is something more insidious. It is not just the risk of death in battle. It is the risk of being forgotten on purpose, of being unmade. Because when the Imperium engineered its new breed of warriors, it did not just create protocols for their creation. It designed mechanisms for their removal. The purge of failures is not spoken of in any formal doctrine, but its shape is clear in the gaps, the silences, the names struck from record before they were ever spoken aloud. A Greyshield can fail in many ways. The most obvious is physical: flaws in gene seed, organs that reject integration, or sudden metabolic collapse. These are the cleanest failures. Such individuals are disposed of quietly, often before they leave the artificial wombs of their creation. The bodies are recycled, the data preserved, the designation reassigned. No name, no history, just a failed iteration in a sequence of trials. In most cases, these failures never attain true consciousness, but some do, even if briefly. A flicker of awareness before clinical termination. A soul born and erased in the span of a heartbeat. More troubling are the psychological failures. Those who exhibit unpredictable emotional responses. Those who question orders not out of defiance but confusion. Those who express attachment, disillusionment, or spiritual longing not coded into their profiles. These are harder to identify, but infinitely more dangerous to the illusion of perfection. When such anomalies arise, the chaplaincy and mechanicus coordinate quietly. The individual is either reintegrated through deep re-indoctrination, a euphemism for neural overwrite, or reassigned to missions with statistically low survival rates. In this way, the system corrects itself without ever appearing flawed. Then there are the ideological failures, the Greyshields who begin to identify too closely with their adopted chapters. Some form genuine bonds with firstborn brothers, embrace chapter customs, even begin to question the sterile rigidity of their own training. They start wearing symbols not assigned to them, reciting rites they were never taught, crafting names for themselves instead of accepting the ones given. This is seen not as growth, but as corruption. For while the Primaris project was designed to strengthen the Astartes, it was also meant to control them. And those who slip the leash, however slightly, are often marked. No one speaks openly of what happens to them. Some disappear after reassignment. Others are declared martyrs in battles no witness can verify. A few are transferred to containment units under inquisitorial oversight. There are rumors of entire squads deemed compromised, removed in secret purges carried out by the Adeptus Custodes or hidden agents of the Ordo Astartes. Even their gene seed is considered tainted, not by chaos but by deviation. And in the Imperium, deviation is the first step to damnation. One of the most haunting aspects of these purges is how impersonal they are. There is no hatred in them, no malice, only clinical finality. The mechanicus does not grieve for failed constructs. The High Lords do not record regrets. Even Guilliman, who once walked among the Greyshields and named them sons, cannot afford to weep for lost prototypes. The machine moves forward, and those who do not fit its parameters are removed like faulty components. This is not heresy. It is hygiene. And yet, for the ones who remain, there is a shadow cast by these purges. They do not speak of it, but they feel it. An unspoken fear beneath the programming. The knowledge that should they falter, Not in battle, but in ideology, they too may be erased. This fear breeds silence, compliance, suppression of doubt. But sometimes, in quiet moments, it slips. A question not meant to be asked. A hesitation in the eye of a warrior who should not know what doubt is. Among the firstborn, such things are met with ritual, brotherhood, counsel. Among the Greyshields, they are met with observation, surveillance, correction. There is no room for healing, only the constant threat of deletion. The purge of failures is not just about removing threats. It is about preserving the lie that the Primaris are perfect, that the Greyshields are infallible, that the Imperium's new future is one of seamless power and order. But lies cannot be buried forever, and every purged soul leaves a crack in the edifice, a memory erased but not forgotten, a name unspoken but not unknown. In the end, the most terrifying truth is this: the Greyshields are not allowed to fail because they were never allowed to be real. And when a thing is not real, its death is not a tragedy. It is a maintenance procedure, a deletion command, a clean slate ready for the next iteration. Tradition is the soul of the Adeptus Astartes. More than their armor, their bolters, or even their gene seed, it is the memory of their brotherhoods, their rituals, their rites, their shared songs and scars that binds them across the stars. Each chapter is a living culture forged in the crucible of history. But with the arrival of the Greyshields, something ancient began to unravel. The songs were no longer sung in the right cadence. The rites felt rehearsed rather than lived. The soul was thinning. The cultural erosion had begun. It started subtly. A missed chant here, a reformatted war prayer there. The Greyshields, trained in perfect recitation, often recited ancient chapter rituals with chilling accuracy but hollow delivery. To outsiders, it looked like reverence. To those within, it felt like mimicry. Firstborn warriors, aged by centuries of fire and blood, saw their cherished customs mirrored by brothers who had not earned them. Rituals once forged in pain and devotion now felt like simulations, performed by minds that understood the words but not the wounds behind them. Many chapters tried to welcome the Greyshields with open arms. They taught them their ways, their rites, their myths. Some succeeded. A few Primaris did adopt the culture of their new homes with sincerity. But for everyone that adapted, a dozen simply went through the motions, carrying out ceremonies like data routines. They learned when to kneel, when to shout, when to grieve. But they did not feel these things, at least not in the way their brothers did. The rites of mourning became sterile. The feasts of victory became efficient debriefings. And in time, the ceremonies themselves began to change. Chaplains, many of them overburdened with trying to shepherd these new minds, began to simplify rites for ease of assimilation. New liturgical forms were introduced. Codified versions of oaths replaced the more obscure localized chants. The shared mythologies of the chapter were replaced with streamlined pan-imperial narratives. In some cases, this brought unity, but in most, it bred homogenization. Unique chapter cultures already worn thin by attrition and time began to dissolve under the pressure of standardization. This was not accidental, it was by design. The Imperium, always fearful of independence within its warrior elite, saw in the Greyshields a chance to reassert control. Tradition is powerful, but also dangerous. It can become loyalty to something other than the Imperium. By inserting cultural neutralizers into the chapters, the High Lords and Mechanicus ensured a steady dilution of divergence. The Greyshields were the vectors. Their presence was the solvent. Over time, T-chapter customs began to fade. The tribal rites of the White Scars were condensed into abstract principles. The long sagas of the Space Wolves were reduced to combat lectures. The Blood Angels' ritual lamentations became nothing more than psychological recalibration routines. It was easier that way, more efficient, less messy, and in that convenience, entire legacies began to vanish. Even the visual identity of the chapters began to suffer. Greyshields were initially deployed in their storm gray armor, only later adorned in chapter colors. But many of them never fully embraced the symbology. They bore the insignia, but not the craftsmanship. Their armor was pristine, unmarked by personal etchings, unconsecrated by individual devotion. The purity seals were placed where regulation dictated, not where spirit moved them. They looked like space marines. But to the firstborn, they looked like mannequins in borrowed warplate. Not all chapters accepted this erosion passively. Some, like the Black Templars, refused full integration. Others quietly isolated their Primaris from ceremonial roles. There were attempts to reteach, to indoctrinate the Greyshields into the old ways. But for many, the damage was already done. The rituals lost meaning once they were reduced to procedure. The culture could not survive when its practitioners no longer believed, or worse, had never known why belief mattered. In time, new cultural forms began to emerge. Hybrid traditions, sterile, generalized, stripped of depth. Chaplains trained to minister to both firstborn and Greyshields began composing rites that were spiritually hollow but doctrinally acceptable. These new forms were celebrated by the administratum as signs of unity. But to many within the chapters, they felt like eulogies, not for the fallen, but for the spirit that once made each chapter unique. And yet, even in this erosion, there remains a flicker of resistance. Some Greyshields, exposed to the raw emotional resonance of true tradition, begin to feel. They carve personal marks into their armor. They speak the old oaths in whispers. They mourn in private, away from doctrinal observers. In these moments, they begin to build a culture of their own, not inherited, but earned. A fragile hope, perhaps, but a real one. Still, for most, the erosion continues. The Greyshields were not designed to carry the burden of legacy. They were made to replace it. And in doing so, they have become the quiet agents of cultural extinction, the unknowing reapers of what once made the Space Marines more than just weapons. They have brought order, yes, uniformity, certainly, but at the cost of soul, at the cost of song. In the shadowed halls of Terra, where forgotten files and sealed vaults gather dust, there are whispers of another age, an age before the Astartes, before the Noble Legions, before the Horus Heresy. There were the Thunder Warriors, genetically enhanced giants, brutal and unstable, forged in desperation by the Emperor during the Unification Wars. They were heroes and monsters, created to conquer old Earth. But when their purpose was fulfilled, they were cast aside, hunted, slaughtered, erased from memory, because they were never meant to last. They were tools of a single war, and once that war was over, they were liabilities. Now many within the lore-bound circles of the Imperium are beginning to see the parallels. The Greyshields, the original Primaris formations, were unleashed at a time of crisis, created in silence, activated in desperation, sent across the stars in the wake of Guilliman's return. They came not to join, but to replace. And like the Thunder Warriors, they were never asked if they wanted to be what they were. They were built, not born. Obedient, not inspired. And as the years stretch on, a chilling question takes root in the hearts of those who watch the tides of the Imperium shift. Are the Greyshields destined to share the same fate? There are signs. The original Greyshield cohorts, once the pride of the Indomitus Crusade, are now slowly vanishing from frontline command. Reassigned, absorbed. Some promoted, yes, but many simply disappear into the labyrinthine structures of the Imperium. The attrition rate is high. The official reasons are always the same: valiant sacrifice, strategic redeployment, classified operations. But the pattern is unmistakable. The Imperium is quietly phasing them out. Not the Primaris as a whole. No, the program continues. But the Greyshields, the prototypes, are being culled. This mirrors the tragedy of the Thunder Warriors with haunting precision. They too were deemed too volatile, too independent, too much a reminder of the methods used to build them. The Emperor could not afford their presence once the dream of unity became a bureaucratic reality. So they were slaughtered. Some resisted, some fled, but most were erased. Not with malice, with necessity. The Greyshields, unlike the Thunder Warriors, are not unstable brutes, but their very existence reveals the uncomfortable truth about the Imperium's desperation and its willingness to sacrifice those who no longer serve the immediate need. They were built without consent, programmed for obedience, and scattered like seeds into a dying galaxy. And now their usefulness may be expiring. Their integration into chapters was always uneasy. Their lack of heritage made them cultural orphans. And as new generations of Primaris are born directly into their chapters, with real rights and bonds, the Greyshields begin to look like a transitional species, a generation meant only to bridge a gap. The lore is murky, but there are hints that Guilliman himself sees this. He walks a razor's edge, needing the Primaris to stabilize the Imperium, yet knowing the methods used to make them are perilously close to heresy. He cannot openly denounce Call, but he keeps his distance. And the Greyshields, though once hailed as saviors, are now seen by some as unfinished symphonies. Useful, but disposable. There are fan theories, grim and compelling, that suggest a darker fate, that once their performance metrics decline or once too many ideological anomalies emerge, the Greyshields may be withdrawn en masse. Not in a purge of fire and blade, but in silence. Quiet operations, reassignments from which there is no return. The Imperium does not need martyrs, it needs continuity. And the Greyshields, with their artificial identities and experimental origins, do not offer legacy. They offer risk. This haunting symmetry with the Thunder Warriors is not lost on those who remember. Few do, but among the Inquisition, the Custodes, the highest echelons of the Mechanicus, there are those who know the full circle. Who remember what it meant to create life for war, and then to erase it for peace. And they watch the Greyshields with the same cold detachment as their forebears once watched the Thunder Warriors. But here lies the difference, a faint glimmer of hope. Some Greyshields have begun to claim identity, to forge bonds, to resist the tide of erasure. They carve their own paths, not as echoes of the Firstborn, but as something new. Not tools, not experiments, warriors, men, souls. If they survive, if enough of them break free from the machinery that made them, they might yet escape the fate of their Proto-Astartes predecessors. Yet the clock is ticking, and history is a wheel, and the Imperium, ever hungry, rarely grants second chances to those who no longer fit its need. If the Greyshields are to avoid becoming footnotes like the Thunder Warriors before them, they must find a voice, not in programmed obedience, but in defiant selfhood. Before they too are forgotten in the silence they were born into. There's something unbearably tragic about watching a legacy unfold in real time, especially one never meant to endure. The Greyshields were born in silence, engineered in secrecy, and deployed in desperation. Their creation was not accompanied by glory, but by calculations. They were never told their story, only what they were expected to do, and yet they bled for worlds that spat on their names. They stood shoulder to shoulder with heroes who would never truly call them brother. And through it all, they believed, not because they were commanded to, but because somewhere, buried beneath the artificial code and imposed identity, something human remained. But what is their legacy? That's the question that lingers now, like the smoke that clings to a battlefield after the guns fall silent. When the war ends, if it ever ends, will anyone remember the Greyshields? Not the Primaris as a whole, but those first cohorts, the storm gray shadows who walked into hell with no name, no past, and often no future? Will their memory be preserved in the halls of honor, or will they vanish, as so many constructs of imperial convenience have before them? They were meant to be the perfect beginning. Instead, they may become the forgotten middle. And yet, perhaps the cruelest truth is this. The Greyshields themselves know it. They may not speak it aloud. Too loyal, too programmed, too bound by duty, but they feel it, in the quiet between battles, in the way Firstborn glance at them sideways during rituals, in the silence when a brother falls and no saga is sung. They sense that they are different, not just improved, unwanted, necessary, yes, valued perhaps, but not loved, not mourned. Some try to fight this, not on the battlefield, there they are beyond reproach, but within. They collect relics, they craft new rites. They build shrines not to old glories, but to the brothers they've lost in silence. They forge identities from fragments, a name earned in a single battle, a war cry shared only among their squad. These are the seeds of legacy, fragile and defiant. And from them, something remarkable begins to grow. There are chaplains who see this and weep, not from pity, but from awe. Because what the Greyshields are doing is something the Imperium never taught them. They are creating meaning. They are not just surviving, they are becoming. Not the second coming of the Legiones Astartes, not the synthetic inheritors of a broken dream, but a new form of warrior, a new kind of soul. Not all will succeed, many will fall before they have the chance. Others will be lost in bureaucracy or buried in missions that no one will remember. But some, a precious few, will endure. And in their endurance, they will rewrite the narrative. They will become legends not because they were designed to, but because they chose to. The irony is profound. The Imperium, in trying to perfect the Space Marine, may have accidentally created the conditions for something even greater. Not a warrior bred for obedience, but a soul forged in absence, clawing toward authenticity. In the void where tradition should have been, in the silence where brotherhood should have sung, the Greyshields may yet find their own voice. And when they do, it will not echo the past, it will resonate with the future. And so if there is to be a legacy, let it be this: that even constructs can find purpose, that even silence can give birth to song, and that the Greyshields, born without history, might one day become the ancestors others revere. Not because they were flawless, but because they refused to be forgotten. If you felt the weight of this truth, if you believe that the forgotten warriors of Warhammer 40k deserve their voice, their story, their honor, then stand with us. Subscribe to the channel, join us as we dig deeper, question louder, and remember those whom the Imperium was all too ready to forget. Thank you for sticking with this journey through one of the Imperium's darkest secrets. If you'd like, I can now compile the full 12-part script into a single document for easy review, editing, or uploading. Would you like me to do that?